So I'd like to start by reiterating the thanks to Petros and the organisers of this excellent event for bringing us all together. My name's Phil Booth. I'm the A.G. Leventis Associate Professor of Eastern Christianity at the University of Oxford. I'm just chairing this session. I'd like to remind everyone to mute their microphones, and if you can, as we've just seen, put questions into the Q&A. I will read them out at the end. Now, it's my great pleasure to be able to introduce to you my colleague, Lucy Parker. The book which we're going to discuss today, which I have here, started life as an Oxford DPhil, which Lucy completed in 2016, and it's now appeared in the series Oxford Studies in Byzantium, like the previous book. Since 2016, Lucy has held a series of prestigious postdoctoral fellowships, including involvement in an ERC project here in Oxford, and then her own British Academy postdoctoral fellowship focusing on monasticism in the early Islamic period. And she's more recently a lecturer in medieval history at Wadham College here in Oxford. Lucy is primarily interested in the religious history of early Byzantium and the early Islamic world. But it should also be said that since the doctorate, she's also been a pioneer in the study of Syriac Christianity in the early modern world. So she has several strings to her bow. And she's published in this field in a number of very high-profile journals, including Past and Present and English Historical Review. But the book reflects her grounding as a Byzantinist. Lucy's book is a study of the very famous Stylites, Symeon the Younger, to be distinguished from the slightly earlier Symeon the Elder, also a Stylite. Symeon the Younger, who operated from a pillar outside of Antioch in the second part of the 6th century. It's a book which I think is remarkably rich. It interweaves a whole series of different narratives, but by means of an introduction, I'm just going to draw out two strands which were particularly exciting for me. First of all, it's a study of the life cycle, we could say, of a holy man and his cult. Lucy uses 3 texts generated by Symeon himself and by his devotees. First, the saint's own sermons. Second, the life of the saint himself, written by his disciples. And finally, a parallel life of Symeon's mother, Martha, who is unique as a saint celebrated for being the mother of a more established saint. And Lucy uses those 3 texts to explore the shifting emphases within the saint's shrine across time and across different contexts, in particular in response to the various challenges confronted by the region in the Justinianic age. So you think warfare, plague, earthquakes, and the like. And I should say that Lucy is also preparing for the Liverpool Translated Text for Historians series. I'm not going to put any pressure on her about that, but she's preparing a series of new English translations of all these texts. So we can look forward to a sequel to the volume also. The second strand I want to draw out before I hand over to Lucy is that this is really a fundamental contribution on the holy person, on the ascetic. And it's a quite different one to the model which still dominates, I think, our understanding. That's the model, of course, of Peter Brown. Lucy's holy person, in contrast to Brown's, I think it's fair to say, is not frozen in time, not simply late antique, but is sharply distinguished from his or her 4th and 5th century predecessors. In fact, for Lucy, the weight of those 4th and 5th century predecessors weighs very heavily on Symeon and his contemporaries. But nor is Lucy's holy person a consensus builder, a social or a cultural consensus builder, but is rather a figure of considerable controversy and polemic as the gulf between expectation, hagiographic expectation maybe, and reality was increasingly exposed amidst successive crises in the course of the 6th and early 7th centuries. In short, if you're interested in the 6th century, if you're interested in the cult of saints, or if you're interested in the holy person, the ascetic, this is essential reading. And at this point, I will hand over to Lucy herself.
Thank you very much. Oh, can you hear me? Thank you very much for the very kind introduction, Phil, and thank you, Petros, for organising this event. I will share my screen briefly. Hopefully it will work smoothly. I'll assume you can see the slides, but please let me know if not. Yes, so this is my book. It has a beautiful image of a pilgrim token from Symeon the Younger's shrine, which is now in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. It shows Symeon on his column, flanked by angels above and by his mother Martha and one of his disciples Conan below. For those of you who are less familiar with Symeon, he lived in the 6th century CE, as Phil has said, near the city of Antioch in northern Syria. So Antioch is here, and Symeon's monastery is on the Mont Admirable, the wonderful mountain to the southwest of Antioch towards the coast. These are the remains of Symeon's monastery. You can see the base of his column in the center of the monastery here. And this is the baptistry from his monastery. So we have rich archaeological evidence associated with Symeon's cult. We also have, he's one of the best textually documented late antique holy men, and it was such a pleasure working on him because of this very exciting body of source material, and much of which hasn't really been studied terribly much. Phil has already mentioned some of the texts that I focus on in my book. But there are 2 late antique hagiographic texts associated with the shrine, as Phil mentioned, the life of Symeon the Younger himself, which is one of perhaps the longest Greek saint's life from late antiquity, an incredibly rich text with, well, all kinds of interesting information, but also a very interesting example of the genre of the saint's life. We also have the life of his mother Martha, which is a completely exceptional text in being a hagiographic life of the mother of a holy man, and I, in my 4th chapter, explore the life of Martha and the context of its creation. But we also have 3 texts apparently written by Symeon himself, which potentially offers us the opportunity to see beyond the kind of distorting lens of hagiography and to look at the holy man sort of through his own words. So one is the sermon collection of 30 sermons attributed to Symeon. The authorship of the sermons isn't certain, but I argue in the book that they should be associated with Symeon, and they give us the opportunity to see his own rhetoric and his own construction of his own authority as a prophet in his time, bringing a message of profound social criticism. There are 2 shorter texts attributed to Symeon, a letter that he apparently wrote to the Emperor Justin II, and a theological quotation preserved in a monothelite Syriac florilegium. Symeon was also a friend of the contemporary church historian Evagrius Scholasticus. So he's met Evagrius, and his church history talks about Symeon and indeed tells us that Symeon performed a miracle for him, miraculously discerning that he had blasphemous thoughts after the death of his children in a disease when his pagan neighbours' children were spared. So we even have this first-hand account of a miracle performed by Symeon. And Symeon's mentioned in the early 7th century hagiographic collection of John Moschus as well. So there's an incredibly rich late antique body of material associated with Symeon, as well as a lot of later material associated with him, which I don't look at in my book. And I tried to, I hope my book, I should say it focuses a lot more on the textual material than on the material and archaeological evidence, but I hope that my book provides an entryway into this incredibly exciting and interesting body of source material. But the question at the heart of my book, and this is the subtitle of my book, is From Hagiography to History. I'm really interested in my own training as a historian. I'm not a theologian or a philologist. My background is in history. And I'm really concerned with how a historian can use hagiography, which is such a notoriously complex and in some ways problematic body of source material for tackling big historical questions. And in my book, I'm particularly interested in the question of the holy man and his role in late antiquity, but also in Antioch in the 6th century. And in some ways, my book is a book about Antioch. Symeon's career is very closely bound up with the local city and region in which he lived. I'm very concerned to embed him in the particular historical context in which he operated. So the first chapter of my book looks at archaeological and textual evidence for the economy and society of Antioch and its surrounding regions in the 6th century. Antioch was one of the most important cities of the late Roman Empire, but in the 6th century, it's experienced a series of disasters. As we know from recent tragic events, it's a very seismically active area, and there are 2 very severe earthquakes in the 520s. It's sacked by the Persians in 540, and like other areas in the empire, it experiences recurrent outbreaks of plague from the 540s onwards. And there's been some debate about whether this causes a period of sort of terminal decline in the history of the city, which echoes wider debates about the state of the Eastern Roman Empire in the 6th century and its condition on the eve of the Arab conquests. And I explore the, in many ways, quite problematic evidence from Antioch, but argue that as well as considering the strictly economic effects of these disasters, we also need to consider their emotional, psychological, religious, and ideological resonances, which could be even more wide-ranging perhaps than the economic effects of disasters. And I argue that Symeon and the corpus of texts associated with him show a sense of profound crisis, I think wouldn't be too far to say, around religious authority and various other ideological considerations in this period. So this ties into my argument about the holy man. As Phil has mentioned, the holy man has, of course, been an incredibly important area of interest for late antique historians since Peter Brown's famous article of 1971, and I don't think it's going too far to say that he's been seen as sort of emblematic of the vibrant, dynamic society, an exciting society of late antiquity that Peter Brown's conjured up so expertly. My holy man, well, the holy man, as I argue, is in an innately fragile and precarious position. And 2 aspects of his role in particular, I think, cause kind of fundamental tensions. First, his role as the performer of miracles, and second, his role as intercessor between God and his supplicants. Obviously, miracles are essential to the success of the holy man, but they also put him in a difficult position, because if he can't perform a miracle, or a miracle doesn't turn out as expected, that can cause disappointment or even skepticism and criticism from his supplicants. And as for his role as intercessor between God and his human supplicants, of course, his supplicants want to avoid disasters, suffering, and earthquakes and other disasters such as this. But if these cannot be prevented, if God's will seems to be for these events to happen, this then puts the holy man in an uncomfortable position, torn between embodying God's will and representing the interests of his supplicants. So I think these tensions exist to a degree from the early emergence of holy men, but I think they become particularly serious by the 6th century because of the heightened expectations across this period. In the 4th century, in the earliest hagiographic texts, we see certain limitations on what is expected of holy men. It's recognized that sometimes they won't be successful in performing miracles, and that's sort of okay. But by the 6th century, certainly in hagiography, I would suggest more broadly, the picture has rather changed. Failure is no longer really acceptable. I mean, there's an incident in the life of Symeon where one of his disciples dies. He tries to bring him back to life, and initially is unsuccessful, but he gets really kind of angry and harangues God and various heavenly powers until eventually he's successful and his disciple returns to life. So I think expectations of holy men's miracle working capacity had got very high by the 6th century. I also argue that they become increasingly associated with the empire and the success of the empire. So holy men are no longer only expected to protect supplicants from disasters, but also to protect the region in which they live and even the empire more broadly. So this creates a sort of perfect storm in a sense, where expectations of the holy man had reached particularly high by the 6th century, but also this is a period in Antioch of the series of repeated disasters that I've mentioned. And I argue in the book that the texts associated with Symeon's shrine show that these disasters did pose a really serious challenge to the authority of the saint, that his supporters seem to have engaged in a thorough attempt to kind of defend him of any criticism for having failed Antioch, failed in his capacity to protect and defend his region. The plague reaches Symeon's own monastery, which is a very sort of serious blow to his own authority. And I argue that the Symeon's supporters tackle this problem in various ways. His hagiographer draws upon biblical models of Job and Abraham, but distorts them and re-employs them in slightly problematic and sometimes conflicting ways to try and exculpate Symeon of any accusation of failure. But I also argue that Symeon and his hagiographer adopt a more aggressive policy. And in particular, we see in both Symeon's sermons and even more explicitly in the life of Symeon, an attack on Antioch's wealthy classes, who are depicted as crypto-pagans whose heathenism is responsible for bringing God's wrath upon the city. So I argue that Symeon and his hagiographer seem to be playing upon latent social tensions in Antioch in order to place the kind of blame for these disasters squarely on a specific social group. And I argue broadly that this the fragility of the position of the holy man is one reason why many of them do seem to play more divisive roles and sometimes more aggressive roles than that perhaps proposed by Peter Brown's original model of the holy man. So it's a book in which I try to explore big questions about religious authority and the position of the holy man in late antiquity, and also to offer some reflections from this perhaps relatively unusual point of view on the state of the Eastern Roman Empire in the 6th century. Thank you. I'll stop sharing. And yes, looking forward to any questions you have. Thank you.